Hello, welcome to Chapter 13, the peripheral nervous system, number 4, fourth video in the peripheral nervous system videos. So this is going to be on the cranial nerves. Okay, so there's 12 cranial nerves, and they all have names and Roman numerals. So the cartoon, well, let's make sure my pen works. Yep. So this cartoon of the inferior surface of the brain shows all the cranial nerves they're cut in the cartoon. And then this guy over here is a mnemonic telling you how to remember the names of the cranial nerves. So the names of the cranial nerves in order from Roman numeral 1 to Roman numeral 12 are the olfactory nerve, the optic nerve, the oculomotor nerve, the trochlear nerve, the trigeminal nerve, the abducens nerve, the facial nerve, the vestibulocochlear nerve, the glossopharyngeal nerve, the vagus nerve, the accessory nerve, and the hypoglossal nerve. And there's lots of mnemonics out there that can help you memorize the names of these cranial nerves. This mnemonic that I have on the right here, this is from the olden days. I liked it because I like mythology, so I was like, and I'm German, so it says, on old Olympus towering tops, a fat vain German viewed a hop. And there's plenty out there. You can Google mnemonics for cranial nerves, or you can make your own, but this is one I like. So for example, the cranial nerve 1 is called the olfactory nerve, and it starts with an O. And then you come over here in our mnemonic, on starts with an O, so, and then on down you go. Now let's look at then where these cranial nerves are in the cartoon. So we said that there's 12 pairs. I didn't explicitly say that, but the cranial nerves come in pairs that extend from the brain stem. So if you remember, the brain stem includes the midbrain. So up here, let's be the midbrain, and then this structure here would be the pons. So you can see them coming out of the pons. And then down here, our hero, the medulla oblongata. Each nerve is identified by a number. It's a Roman numeral. You can't use non-Roman numerals. Most of the cranial nerves are mixed / both, so you can call them mixed nerves, or you can say the nerves have both sensory afferent axons and motor efferent axons. And here's, so now in this part I just put the cranial nerve, the first letter of the cranial nerve, where that nerve is approximately located. So, and we'll go over each one of these cranial nerves, but here's the olfactory nerve, comes here. The optic nerve is cut here. The oculomotor nerve, and remember there's one on each side, so these paired oculomotor nerves, this is cut. This is the trochlear nerve, cut. This big one is the trigeminal nerve, cut. This one, go a little more medial. This is the abducens, that's cut. This guy is cut, it's the facial nerve. And then the vestibulocochlear, here the glossopharyngeal. This big one is the vagus. And then you come to the accessory nerve here. And then this one, medial, is the hypoglossal nerve. There's another mnemonic to remember to help you remember if the cranial nerve is purely sensory, so that means it only has sensory afferent axons in it. Or if it's purely motor, that would be an M, and that means it would only have motor efferent neuron axons traveling in it. Or you could be a cranial nerve that has both sensory afferent axons and motor efferent axons. And here's a mnemonic to remember that, and you can find mnemonics online, one that you might like. So this mnemonic, so cranial nerve 1, that's the olfactory nerve, so it starts out with some, and that means the cranial nerve number 1, the olfactory nerve, is purely sensory, so it only carries sensory afferent axons in it. Say, so S, that cranial nerve number 2 would be purely sensory. Cranial nerves 3 and 4 would be motor, and this is a little tricky because they're mostly motor. And then cranial nerve number 5 starts with a B here, but so that would mean that cranial nerve number 5 has both sensory and motor axons in them. Here's another motor nerve. Here's a nerve that has both sensory and motor. Here's purely sensory. Here's both. Brains both. Matter motor. Most motor. So you can stop the video right now and go find your own favorite mnemonic. Mnemonic. That's funny. I was thinking pneumonia. Mnemonic. Mnemonic. Okay. So we just went over this, and it shows you on the cartoon. It labels the nerves. So for example, the olfactory nerve, the nerve filaments will actually come out of these pieces here, the cribriform plate. But then it tells you here, next to the Roman numeral 1, it says S. So that means the olfactory nerve is a purely sensory nerve. That means it's only sending sensory afferent neurons from your nasal cavity to the brain. And then here's our 2 mnemonics over here. So this on the left side, this mnemonic is going to tell you if the nerve is purely sensory, purely motor, or has both sensory and motor axons in it. And then this mnemonic will tell you, will help you remember the name of the cranial nerve. And then there's some accessory structures on here that aren't the nerves, but they're still important to know about them. We'll see a better picture of this. So there's the olfactory nerve is associated with the olfactory bulb and the olfactory tract. So the olfactory bulb and the olfactory tract are not the olfactory nerve. So don't mess that up on a test. And we'll show what is actually in the olfactory bulb and the olfactory tract in a minute. And then you have, here's the optic nerve. The optic nerve, cranial nerve 2, it's purely sensory. And you also have this structure called an optic chiasm. So this area here is the optic chiasm, and you have an optic tract. So, but those are the optic chiasm and the optic tract are not the optic nerve, but they are structures associated with the optic nerve. Okay. So this gives the information in table form, which a lot of people like. So here's cranial nerves 1 through 6. It shows the number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Here's the names: olfactory, optic, oculomotor, trochlear, trigeminal, and abducens. And then it says, does it have a sensory function? That means, is it carrying axons of sensory afferent neurons, or does it have a motor function? Means, is that nerve carrying axons of motor efferent neurons? So, and we talked about this, the olfactory nerve is purely sensory. It does not have a motor function. And now this column, we'll talk a little bit about this column, but not much, because PS means parasympathetic. And we'll talk about the the parasympathetic nervous system when we talk about the autonomic nervous system, and we'll talk about where parasympathetic nervous system fibers run. But for example, there are no parasympathetic fibers or axons associated with the olfactory nerve, but there are some parasympathetic fibers associated with your oculomotor nerve, cranial nerve number 3, and those parasympathetic nerve fibers actually can change the diameter of your pupil. Okay, and then I have here in red, it says motor efferent nerves carry impulses away from the CNS, just to remind you of that. And then sensory afferent nerves carry impulses toward the CNS. So let's look at each cranial nerve in turn. This is a cartoon of the olfactory cranial nerve number 1, the olfactory nerve, and we'll start here in the mnemonic I use. So O is on. In my on old Olympus towering tops, fat vein German view to hop. We're at O, and then this in this cartoon you do, looks like a sagittal section out of this area of face, and you look inside. So this would be the external nares. This is the opening to your nose. Here's a tooth, if that gives you any bearing. And then this whole area is your nasal cavity. And then it tells you here are filaments of the olfactory nerve. So these little guys at the ends here on the dendrites, they have little receptors for odorant molecules. Those odorant molecules bind and you get a receptor potential. And then if enough odorant molecules bind, you get an action potential that travels along the axon. And then those filaments go up through this thing called the cribiform plate of the ethmoid bone. So this plate it's a bone, but it's got a lot of perforations or holes in it, so that the filaments or the axons of the olfactory nerve can get to this thing called an olfactory bulb. And next slide I have a cartoon to show what's going on in the olfactory bulb. But then the axons of the neurons from the olfactory bulb will travel in the olfactory tract into the brain. So then what I'm going to do on each of these cranial nerves, there'll be kind of a stat sheet on the side. So it'll tell you the origin and course of the nerve. So the olfactory nerve fibers arrive from olfactory sensory neurons located in the olfactory epithelium of the nasal cavity. So these olfactory sensory neurons are here. And then it tells you kind of how the fibers or the axons run to get to the brain. And we talked about this, the olfactory nerve is a purely sensory nerve. And then sometimes we'll have these homeostatic imbalance stats, fracture of the ethmoid bone, or if you get a lesion in your olfactory nerve fibers, you could have total loss of smell. That makes sense. This is a cartoon of an olfactory sensory afferent neuron. So that the dendrites are out here. You would bind odorant molecules here out in the dendrite. Here's the cell body of the sensory afferent neuron. Then here's the axon, aka the fiber, aka the filament of that olfactory sensory neuron. I like this cartoon because it shows the details of what's going on in the olfactory epithelium and the bulb. So if you look down, and we'll see this cartoon again when we do the olfactory system, we do the special senses. So the route of inhaled air, so the air is coming in this way, and you have some mucus, as you know, in your the roof of your nasal cavity. And then here's the here's the olfactory sensory afferent neuron. Okay, there's a lot of other cells in the olfactory epithelium that we'll talk about when we talk about this in more detail, but the odorant molecules would be out here getting trapped in the mucus, and then the dendrites of the olfactory sensory afferent neurons, if there's a receptor for that odorant molecule, it would bind to it, and then you'd get a local or graded potential or a receptor potential. Kind of those three things are kind of the same. And then that information, if enough odorants bind, or they bind strongly enough, the information about the odorant molecule binding will travel as an action potential along the axon of our olfactory sensory afferent neuron. It will go here through a hole in the cribriform plate of the ethmoid bone, and then you can see that it comes up here, and that the axon of the sensory afferent neuron will synapse with this other cell called a mitral cell. So you get a synapse here. There's neurotransmitter release, and the structure where they synapse is called a glomeruli. And then that mitral cell will send an action potential along this thing called the olfactory tract. So remember, if you are a bundle of axons in the peripheral nervous system, you are a nerve. If you're a bundle of axons in the central nervous system, you are a tract. So it's the same thing. You're a bundle of axons. You just have a different name if you're in the peripheral nervous system or the central nervous system. And so these mitral cell axons are in the central nervous system now. So those neurons, axons, would be traveling in a tract. Okay, so now we're on cranial nerve number 2, and it's got an S. So that means it's purely sensory. And then we'll keep track over here in our mnemonic. So we're at cranial nerve number 2. So we're SAY for if you are sensory, motor, or both. And then I'm on OLD for Arnold Olympus Towering Tops. Okay, so again, this is over here. This is an inferior view of the brain. You can see here's the eyeballs. And then at the back of the eyeball, you have this thing called a retina, which we'll talk a whole lot about when we do the special sensus. But this is your retina at the back of the eyeball, so the light is coming in this way. And then above this cartoon, I did this cartoon, because this is actually an enlarged cartoon of the retina. So it's kind of interesting, but light would be coming in this way, and then the light waves, or the photons in the waves, would pass through these ganglion cells and these bipolar cells, and then the light waves will hit these cells called rods and cones. So this guy that has a little cone on top, that's a cone cell, and then these purple things are rod cells. And then the light waves hit those guys, and then the light waves are the stimulus, and then they'll transduce potential, and if the potential is such that enough light has come in, then they'll send a neurotransmitter to the bipolar cells. The bipolar cells will send a neurotransmitter to the ganglion cells, and then the ganglion cells, their axons are all going to travel in this thing called the optic nerve. And then this is kind of cool. The axons from the ganglion cells in the retina, they cross over, but only half of them do. So it's not full decussation, it's hemidecussation. So if you see these tan axons from the, let's see, this is an inferior view, so this would be your left eyeball, and this would be your right eyeball. So these tan neurons from your left eyeball do cross over to the other side, and then they go to a special nucleus called the lateral geniculate nucleus of the thalamus. So here's the thalamus, the nucleus of the thalamus. But then look at these green axons from the ganglion cells. They don't cross over, but they do go to the same nucleus, a lateral geniculate nucleus that lives in the thalamus. And then the right eyeball does the same thing. And where they cross over, that's called the optic chiasm. And then from the optic chiasm, where they travel within the brain to the thalamus, that's called the optic tract. But the cranial nerve that we're interested in here is the optic nerve, number 2. And then here's the stats. So the fibers or axons arise from the retina of the eye, and that's what we showed here. The axons of these ganglion cells arise from the retina of the eye. It forms the optic nerve. So ganglion cell axons are traveling here. It's the optic nerve. And then the optic nerve passes through this bone structure called the optic canal of the eye orbit. And then we talked about how the optic nerves converge to form the optic chiasm, where they do hemidecussation, and then the fibers go to the optic tract. They go into the thalamus, and then from the thalamus, they synapse there, and then those axons run back here to the visual cortex. And then you see something. And then I've got a little note here, cranial nerve 2, the optic nerve, forms a chiasm. So we just look at the chiasm at the base of the brain where you have partial crossover of these neural fibers or axons. That's called hemidecussation. All right, so I'm going to show you this cartoon now because I need to explain the cranial nerves. And then I will also talk about this cartoon a lot next time, I think in the next lecture in this series, because this shows muscle spindles. So this is a cartoon of a muscle spindle. I bet you can kind of tell this is a muscle, right? Because you can see the striations. And then the muscle unites with the white stuff, that's the tendon. So you have this muscle spindle in purple, and then this guy is a Golgi tendon organ or reflex. So the parts of the, and then up here in the top right, I put a cartoon showing what we've already discussed when we talk about the muscular system. So here's a muscle cut in cross section, and then you see all these muscle cells they're synapsing with axons of motor neurons at the neuromuscular junction. So these are two different concepts, but we're going to talk about them when we do the rest of the cranial nerves. Okay, so now back to our muscle spindle. So in all your skeletal muscles, you have this thing called a muscle spindle, and it's purple. Just kidding, it's not purple in your body, but it's this purple connective tissue capsule. And on the inside, you have these things called intrafusal muscle fibers that live inside the muscle spindle. So that's this guy right here is an intrafusal fiber inside the muscle spindle. It's kind of a modified skeletal muscle. You can see intrafusal muscle fiber. And then on the you have just outside of the muscle spindle, you have this area called the extrafusal muscle fiber. And then these blue things are primary sensory endings, and they're also called type 1A fibers. But you can see this blue sensory ending is wrapped around this intrafusal muscle. And it does that so that it can detect the amount of stretch in the within your muscle. And then you also have these secondary sensory endings in purple, and you can see they come inside the capsule. And then I think we've got the efferent motor fiber to the intrafusal muscle fibers inside the muscle spindle. So this is efferent, so that's motor efferent fiber. And then you have this orange thing, it's an alpha efferent motor fiber to the extrafusal, or the muscle fibers, so it's outside the capsule. But anyway, for this test, you don't have to know all these parts of the muscle spindle. You just have to know that you have sensory afferent neurons that are sending information along these sensory neurons to the brain to tell you the tension in your muscle, and also the tension in your tendons. So this Golgi tendon organ down here will actually prevent excessive tension in a muscle pulling on the tendon. So this will allow you to initiate a reflex so that you don't damage your muscle. Okay, so now in this cartoon, I already showed you this guy up top. So this is the skeletal muscle, the neuromuscular junction. This is the cartoon of the muscle spindle. So here's the capsule, or the capsule of the muscle spindle. Here's these yellow things are the sensory nerve fibers. Well, actually, they're the sensing part. They're the sensory nerve endings of the sensory afferent neuron. Here's the sensory afferent neuron nerve fiber that's going to send an action potential that will tell you, your brain, the amount of stretch on that skeletal muscle. Okay, so now we can go to cranial nerve number 3, which is mostly motor, but these are skeletal muscles in your eye. So you don't have to know all these names for this test, but you'll have to know them when we do the special senses, the eye. But there are all these skeletal muscles that control your eye movement. So for example, the medial rectus, the superior rectus, there's an inferior rectus, and if there's a medial rectus, there's a lateral rectus. And I don't see. Oh yeah, so if this is the medial rectus, this guy right here would be the lateral rectus that's cut. Okay, so all these are skeletal muscles. And the oculomotor, so oculo means eye, and then motor means movement. This nerve, cranial nerve 3, the oculomotor nerve, comes out of this area of the brainstem called the midbrain, and it travels through this part of the bone called the superior orbital fissure, and then it goes into your eye, and it innervates the skeletal muscles of the eye. And there's also there's a ciliary ganglia where you synapse with parasympathetic fibers that we'll talk about when we do the parasympathetic nervous system. So here's the stats on oculomotor cranial nerve number 3. It says here the fibers extend from the ventral midbrain, so this would be ventral, and then dorsal would be here. Goes through a bony orbit and it innervates the skeletal muscle. The function, it says that the oculomotor cranial nerve 3 is chiefly motor, but there's a few proprioceptive afferents. Whenever it says that, the proprioceptive afferents have to do with the sensory afferents coming out of this muscle spindle that we talked about. So there's within the cranial nerve number 3, the oculomotor nerve, there will be these sensory afferent neurons, but there will also be, in that same nerve, there will be these motor efferent neurons that I'm showing up here in the top right. And they call them proprioceptive afferents because proprioception is just a term knowing where your body is in space. So you could call them proprioceptive sensory afferents. So yeah, and then here's our mnemonic. We're on the third cranial olympus. The fourth cranial nerve, so we're here on old Olympus, towering, T for trochlear, and then M in our mnemonic if it's sensory, motor, or mixed. So it's a motor nerve. However, it is a skeletal muscle. So this trochlear nerve number 4, coming out of the midbrain and going through the superior orbital fissure to innervate this superior oblique muscle, which is a skeletal muscle. All skeletal muscles have these sensory afferent neurons within these within these reflex capsules in the skeletal muscles. So it's mostly motor, and they tell you primarily motor nerves. And then it will say, because it's skeletal muscles, there's some proprioceptive fibers. Proprioceptive fibers meaning sensory afferent fibers that allow you to do proprioception. So the trochlear nerve, this is an interesting nerve because it only innervates one skeletal muscle in your eye, and that's this superior oblique muscle. And they call it the trochlear nerve because you can see here that this connective tissue is attached to your eyeball, and then it goes through this little notch thing, this little notch called the trochlea, and then hooks up with the superior oblique muscle. So it's one whole cranial nerve for just one small muscle in your eye. Interesting. All right, so now, almost halfway done. We're in the cranial nerves, the trigeminal cranial nerve number 5. So tri means there's a lot of pieces to it. There's 3 pieces to it, and it's both. It has both sensory afferent neuron axons and motor efferent axons. The trigeminal nerve does a lot of general senses, so touch, taste, and pressure. And then, so those would be the general sensory as opposed to special senses like vision and olfaction. These are just general sensory afferents in your trigeminal nerve. And then there's also, because this trigeminal nerve carries both sensory afferent axons and motor efferent axons, it gets the ranking of a B for both. So a lot of these motor nerves help you chew, and these trigeminal nerves are found in your face. And then in this cartoon, I just remind you what a sensory afferent neuron is. So here's the free dendrites. The stimulus could be cold, and then the dendrites will initiate a generator potential, which if it's cold enough, the generator potential will allow for an action potential, travel along the length of the axon. So here's a trace of the action potential. And then these axon terminals will terminate in the brain. So in this cartoon, I got the trigeminal nerve in a red square, and it shows it right here. So here's the trigeminal nerve, and associated with trigeminal nerve is a trigeminal ganglion. And then there's 3 divisions to the trigeminal nerve. That's for trigeminal. There's the ophthalmic division. So that division goes through this piece of the bone called the superior orbital fissure, and then it goes out to these parts of the face. There's a maxillary division of the trigeminal nerve. So the maxillary division you can see goes to the maxilla, so that's the upper part of just above your teeth. So this is your maxilla, or maxilla. And then there's a mandibular division of the trigeminal nerve that innervates areas of your mandible and also your tongue. And so here we are with our mnemonic, so both. So we're at cranial nerve 5, that's butt, and tops, so for trigeminal. Trigeminal nerve includes innervation of your tongue. And it says here it's the largest, the trigeminal nerve is the largest of your cranial nerves. And the fibers or the axons extend from the pons. So here's the pons. The fibers come out of the pons, form 3 divisions. We talked about that. We said touch, temperature, and pain, also pressure. And then the mandibular division here, the mandibular division of the trigeminal nerve, so here also contains motor fibers that innervate your chewing muscles, so your masseter, for example, your chewing muscle. So one more slide on the trigeminal. If you're going to be a dentist or a dental hygienist, when you go to the dentist, you numb before they're going to do some painful thing to your mouth. Dental injections will injection they give you will be numbing the trigeminal nerve. So you can say that to your dentist next time and look real smart. There is this really horrible condition called tic douloureux, caused by inflammation of the trigeminal nerve. So when it gets inflamed, it says it's widely considered to produce the most excruciating pain known. So that sounds pretty terrible. So don't get tic douloureux. All right. Yay, we're halfway done. We're on cranial nerve number 6. That's called the abducens. So remember back at the beginning of the semester when we talked about adduction and abduction. So the abducens is another cranial nerve that singularly innervates one skeletal muscle of the eye, and that skeletal muscle that it innervates is called the lateral rectus muscle. So here's the abducens nerve coming out of the inferior portion of the pons, and the nerve travels through the superior orbital fissure, and then it innervates this muscle called the lateral rectus muscle. So the lateral rectus muscle is cut here and it's cut here, but a single cranial nerve dedicated to one muscle in your eye, the lateral rectus muscle. So it's primarily abducens. Cranial nerve number 6 is primarily a motor nerve, but because it's a skeletal nerve, it's got this sensory part to it that sends information about where this muscle, the lateral rectus muscle, is in space. That's called proprioception. Okay, cranial nerve 7 is called the facial nerve, and it's got a B by it, so that means it has both sensory afferent information and motor efferent information traveling in that nerve. This part A shows the parasympathetic efferents and sensory afferents. So that just means that the parasympathetic efferents, that's motor efferents going out to innervate. Well, if it's parasympathetic, it's going out to innervate smooth muscle cells that surround the glands. So here's the sublingual gland, the submandibular gland, the lacrimal gland, So all these glands, in order for them to produce their glandular material, so in this case the submandibular gland and lingual gland, saliva, there are smooth muscle cells that can contract, and the gland contracts and sends the saliva through these ducts to get into your oral cavity. So that would be part of the parasympathetic efferent nervous system, because parasympathetic nervous system will innervate the smooth muscle cells. And then here's on letter B, it says the motor branches to the muscles of facial expression and scalp muscles. So these are all branches of the facial nerve. So you can see this nerve goes to the temporal area, the zygomatic area, that's, remember the zygomatic arch, the buccal means cheek, mandibular has to do with your mandible, this area, and then the cervical branches of the facial muscle. And then I have here, I don't know if you've heard of this condition called Bell's palsy, is characterized by paralysis of your facial muscles through a problem with the facial nerve. So here's some more stats on the facial nerve. So the fibers come from the pons. So neurons, the neuron cell bodies are in the pons. They get in out of the brain through the skull via this thing called an internal acoustic meatus in the temporal bone. And their function is, they're just the chief motor nerves of the face, but there's 5 branches, and we looked at that in the previous cartoon. And here's a possible test question. So a patient got a blow to the side of the skull and exhibited the following signs and symptoms on that side of the face. So let's say he gets a blow to the left side of the skull. What happens on that side of the face? So they can't close their eyes. The corner, the eye, excuse me, on the left side of the face, the corner of the mouth droops on the left side. That means the facial nerve has been damaged. And it's also important to note that the facial cranial nerve 7, the facial nerve, has connections to the tongue. So this bullet over here, the facial nerve will convey sensory impulses from the taste buds of the anterior 2/3 of your tongue. And we'll talk about that when we do the special senses and taste. Okay, so we're down here on number 7, cranial nerve, almost done. Cranial nerve 8 is called the vestibulocochlear nerve, and that's a sensory nerve. So that deals with balance and equilibrium. So the vestibulo part of the vestibulocochlear nerve is this right here, the vestibule. And then the cochlear part of the vestibulocochlear nerve is this here, the cochlea. So the cochlea deals with hearing. Let me back up. You can tell this is in your inner ear, right? So here's the outside of your ear, inside the ear. So the cochlea deals with hearing, and then the vestibule and semicircular canals deal with balance. And then you can see in this cartoon, this vestibulocochlear nerve comes out of the inferior aspects of the pons, at the border of the pons and the medulla oblongata. And this is just a cartoon of a hair cell within the cochlea. And it shows this is a dendrite of a sensory neuron. Here's a hair cell, and then when these little projections on the hair cell move this way or that way, it will send a message to this hair cell about sound, and then the hair cell will alert the dendrite of the sensory neuron as to what that sound is, or the intensity of the sound. Okay, so these are mostly sensory. This vestibular cochlear nerve 8 is mostly sensory because you're sensing equilibrium and hearing. So cranial nerve 9 is the glossopharyngeal, or you could say glossopharyngeal, has to do with taste and swallowing. So it's cranial nerve 9. Here it is. You can see it looks like it's coming out of the superior part of the medulla oblongata, because the medulla starts here. And then it comes through this opening in the bone called the jugular foramen. And then it's got several ganglions along the way. So when we talk about the parasympathetic nervous system, we'll talk about that. But you can see that the glossopharyngeal, so glosso means tongue. So you're going to have a part of that glossopharyngeal nerve go to your tongue. So if you couldn't tell, this is your tongue. Here's the glossopharyngeal nerve going to your tongue. And then pharyngeal, so that's pharynx, and the common name for the pharynx is the throat. So you can see the other parts of the glossopharyngeal nerve going to the areas of the throat. In the tongue, so this cartoon shows a taste pore. So you'd find this in your tongue. And so the tastant molecules would go into the taste pore, and then these gustatory hair cells would bind those tastant molecules, and then they'd send a signal to this sensory afferent, the dendrites, and then the axons would travel in cranial nerve 9, and then the information would eventually get back to the gustatory cortex, and you would taste something. Okay. Oh, glossopharyngeal, yeah, the fibers emerge from the medulla, so the superior part of the medulla. They leave the skull via the jugular foramen, and we looked at that. They're mixed nerves, so they basically serve part of the tongue and the pharynx. Okay, number 10, cranial nerve number 10 is the vagus. Okay, so let's look at this part of the cartoon. Here's the medulla oblongata, so the fibers for the vagus, cranial nerve 10 come out of the medulla oblongata, and they leave the brain via this thing called the jugular foramen, and there's many ganglia along the way, and we'll do a lot with the vagus nerve in this semester when we do the autonomic nervous system. And there's lots of branches to the vagus nerve, but we have here this first branch is the pharyngeal nerve branch that goes to areas of the muscles of the pharynx. There's a laryngeal branch that goes to the muscles of the larynx. But a lot of the fibers from the vagus nerve do go to far distances. So, for example, the vagus nerve can run to the lung, the heart, the spleen, the gallbladder, the liver, stomach, kidney, small intestines, and the colon. So the vagus is a really long nerve, goes a lot of places. And what it does is it carries visceral motor efferent neurons of the parasympathetic nervous system. And like I said, it extends beyond the head and neck region, so it goes out to all those different places. So the vagus nerve, it's mixed, so it's got sensory and motor axons in it. Almost all the motor fibers are parasympathetic efferent motor neurons. And you can also transmit sensory information from the thoracic and abdominal viscera. So sensory afferent neurons will take information from the heart and lungs, for example, back to the brain. Okay, cranial nerve 11, the accessory nerve, so it's mostly motor. And this is something that you should note, that this is a cranial nerve that emerges from the spinal cord, not the brainstem. So all the other cranial nerves that we've looked at previously emerge from the brainstem, but the accessory nerve, cranial nerve 11, does not. And it supplies motor efferent neurons to the trapezius muscle and the SCM. So the SCM is the sternocleidomastoid. Woohoo! Number 12, the hypoglossal. So hypo means below, glossal means tongue and swallowing. So hypoglossal cranial nerve 12 allows you to move your tongue, and it allows you to swallow. So it's it innervates some skeletal muscles. That means if there's skeletal muscle there, you're going to have some sensory afferent neurons telling you about the proprioceptive status of that muscle.